Somewhere in the ridge and hollow country where Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky converge, there is a people who defied every category America ever tried to put them in. Dark skin, straight black hair, high cheekbones, eyes that sat wrong under every racial label the census offered. Their neighbors called them Melungeons. The Melungeons called themselves Portuguese, or Turkish, or Cherokee. Whatever name kept the sheriff from writing colored in the ledger. For 2 centuries, no one could prove anything either way. The origin stories multiplied. Lost colonists of Roanoke, shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, Ottoman Turks left behind by a Spanish expedition. Each theory more exotic than the last, and none of them pinned down by a single document anyone could read in a courtroom. Then, scientists began collecting DNA. They tested the core Melungeon families. They compared the results against European populations, African populations, and every documented Native American tribal lineage in the database. What they found was not what anyone expected, not exotic, not simple, not the story any Melungeon family had been telling for 3 generations. The DNA told a different story, and only one Native American line stood out. Before any scientist drew a blood sample, the Melungeons existed as a legal problem. They were free, that was the first thing. In a society built around the color line, a group of dark-skinned people who were technically free and who refused to be categorized as enslaved was not a curiosity, it was a threat. The earliest written use of the word Melungeon appears in the minutes of a primitive Baptist church in Scott County, Virginia in 1813. A church member named Susanna Kitchen filed a complaint against another woman for, as the record puts it, harboring them Melungeons. The word was not a self-description, it was a verdict. Nobody knows for certain where the word itself came from. Some researchers have traced it to the Kimbundu word Melungu, used by Angolan Africans in colonial Virginia to describe people who shared a vessel, a ship, a common crossing. Others connect it to a French or Portuguese root. What is not disputed is what the word meant on the ground. It meant these people are not white. We are not sure what they are, and we do not want them in our church. The original Melungeon community concentrated along Newman's Ridge and the Blackwater Valley in what became Hancock County, Tennessee, when that county was carved from Hawkins and Claiborne counties in 1844. The core families, Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, Minor, had been living in that narrow corridor of ridgelines and creek hollows since the late 1700s. Land records, tax rolls, and deed books from Hawkins County show these families clustered together, intermarrying, acquiring small grants of land, and subsisting on a mix of farming and hunting. They were not hiding exactly, but they had found a terrain that made asking questions expensive. The families who ended up on Newman's Ridge did not materialize there. They migrated in stages, and the paper trail, when researchers finally pulled it together, told a precise story. Jack Goins, Hawkins County archivist and one of the original founders of the core Melungeon DNA project at Family Tree DNA, spent decades tracing these families backward through courthouse records. His research, which later formed the basis of his 2009 book Melungeons, Footprints from the Past, tracked the original Hawkins County families through the New River area of Virginia, then back through the Flat River area, and finally into Louisa County, Virginia, in the mid-1700s. That is where the trail begins to make sense. In colonial Virginia, before the full machinery of chattel slavery had locked into place, there existed a class of people described in census and court records as free persons of color. They were landowners. Some had fought in the Revolutionary War and collected land grants for their service. Vardy Collins, believed to be the first settler on Newman's Ridge, moved from Virginia to what would become Hancock County around 1779 or 1780. Solomon Collins and Tyra Gibson followed. George Goins held a land grant from the state of Kentucky. His father, Joseph Goins, was a Revolutionary War recipient from North Carolina. These were not wanderers. They were a community in motion, moving together through the frontier, always slightly ahead of the laws that would have reclassified them. As Virginia, and then North Carolina, and then Tennessee enacted laws forbidding the intermarriage of whites and people of African or native descent, these families moved deeper into the mountains. The isolation of Newman's Ridge was not accident, it was survival. The deepest layer of the Melungeon story begins not in Tennessee, but in Tidewater, Virginia in 1619. That year, a Dutch privateer sailed into Point Comfort, carrying a cargo of Africans seized from a Portuguese slave ship, the São João Bautista, in the Gulf of Mexico. These were Ndongo people from the Kingdom of Angola, Kimbundu speaking, many of them at least nominally Christian after generations of Portuguese missionary contact. They came not as permanent slaves, since chattel slavery had not yet been codified in Virginia law, but as indentured servants, the same legal category that bound thousands of English laborers to Virginia tobacco planters. Serve your term, pay your debt, go free. In the 1640s and 1650s, some of these Africans did exactly that. They went free, acquired land, and in several documented cases, married white women. Francis Payne of Northampton County paid off his indenture around 1,650 by purchasing 3 white servants for his master's use and went on to marry a white woman named Amy. John Guillaume, recorded as a Negro servant, was free by 1641. These were not isolated cases. There were at least 33 African Americans in Northampton County in the 1670s who were free or had free children. Then Virginia began to change. In 1662, the colony passed a law making the status of a child follow the mother, not the father. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved. If the mother was free, the child was free, regardless of the father's color. This single statute would shape everything that followed. Free African men who had married white women produced free children. Those free children, increasingly hemmed in by tightening racial laws, began to intermarry with each other. By the 1670s, Tim Hashaw's research into Kimbundu naming patterns suggests these families were already calling themselves by the word that would eventually reach a Scott County church record in 1813. Claiming Portuguese ancestry was not confusion, it was strategy. As Virginia's racial laws tightened through the late 1600s and into the 1700s, the legal consequences of being classified as a person of African descent became severe. Free people of color in antebellum Tennessee and Virginia could not vote, could not testify in court against white citizens, and could not own certain categories of property. The Melungeon families fought these disabilities in court, and their attorneys argued, sometimes successfully, that they were not African in the legal sense at all. The most vivid example comes from an 1874 Tennessee court case in which a Melungeon woman named Martha Simmerman stood to lose an inheritance if she were found to have African blood. Her attorney, Lewis Shepard, argued successfully that the family descended from ancient Phoenicians who had migrated to Portugal and then to North America. The court accepted it. Being Portuguese meant being European. Being European meant being white in the law's understanding, and being white meant keeping the property. By the early 1800s, many Melungeon families had been making this claim for so long that it had passed from legal tactic to oral tradition to genuine family belief. Will Allen Dromgoole, a journalist who spent time in the Hancock County Melungeon community in the 1890s and wrote widely read newspaper accounts of what she found there, documented families who stated with total conviction that their ancestors were Portuguese. Some families claimed Cherokee ancestry instead, a claim that was more sympathetic than African and more geographically plausible. Some claimed Turkish descent. Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, which forbade marriages between whites and anyone with non-white ancestry, made these claims matter urgently as late as the 20th century. Some Melungeons found existing marriages suddenly invalidated. Others were denied marriage licenses after generations of living as white. The story they told about themselves was not romantic mythology. It was the price of survival. The modern reckoning with Melungeon ancestry began not with a scientific institution, but with a community archivist. Jack Goins, Hawkins County, Tennessee's chief archivist, and a Melungeon descendant himself, had spent decades accumulating courthouse records, land grants, and family histories. In 2005, he founded the core Melungeon DNA project at Family Tree DNA, the first systematic attempt to apply genetic genealogy to the question that had occupied historians and court records for 2 centuries. The project had a simple design: gather male descendants of the families documented in historical records as Melungeon, test their Y chromosome DNA, which passes unchanged from father to son, and their mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child through the female line. Compare the results against global population databases. The challenge was defining the group. The popular press had expanded the definition of Melungeon dramatically by the early 2000s, attaching the label to almost any mixed ancestry family in southern Appalachia. Goins and his co-researchers went back to primary sources. A family was included only if there was documented historical evidence, a court record, a census notation, a church minute directly applying the label Melungeon to that family, or to an ancestor who had married into a core Melungeon line. The final study group was built from the surnames that appeared in those primary records: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Minor, Mullins, and a handful of others. Over time, descendants of most of these family lines submitted both Y chromosome and mitochondrial samples. Roberta Estes, a scientist and genetic genealogist who would serve as lead author on the resulting paper, joined Goins along with co-researchers Penny Ferguson and Janet Lewis Crane to build the analysis. Their paper, Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population, was published in April 2012 in the peer-reviewed Journal of Genetic Genealogy. Before I show you the last part, if you want to look at your own results and see where Melungeon ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. The results of the 2012 study were not what the Melungeon community expected. Most people going into the project expected Native American ancestry to dominate. The oral tradition was nearly universal across Melungeon families. Every family had a Cherokee grandmother or a Creek great-grandfather somewhere in the line. The DNA said otherwise. On the paternal side, the Y chromosome results, the direct male line, were split approximately half and half between sub-Saharan African haplogroups and European haplogroups. Not a single core Melungeon Y chromosome line came back with a Native American result. On the maternal side, the mitochondrial results, the direct female line, were uniformly European. Every maternal line tested for the core Melungeon families was of Northern or Central European origin. Lead researcher Roberta Estes summed up the reaction plainly when the paper came out. There were a whole lot of people upset by this study, she said. They just knew they were Portuguese or Native American. The sub-Saharan African Y chromosome results fit precisely with the colonial Virginia origin theory. The founding male ancestors of the Melungeon lines were African men, most of them almost certainly descended from the Angolan indentured servants who had arrived in Virginia in the early 1600s and who had, before the full apparatus of racial slavery closed around them, married European women and produced free children. Those free children were the mothers of the Melungeon community. Their Y chromosomes were African. Their mitochondrial lines were European, and the Portuguese ancestry that had been claimed in courtrooms and family Bibles for 200 years was not genetic reality. It was a survival document written in plain language and repeated until it became memory. No direct Melungeon family line tested positive for Native American ancestry through the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial line. That was the headline that upset people. But the study found something that the headline missed. One ancestral line connected to the core Melungeon families did carry verified Native American DNA, and when researchers traced it, the result was precise enough to name. The Sizemore family was never referred to as Melungeon in primary historical documents. They were not a core Melungeon surname, but Aggie Sizemore, daughter of a man named George Sizemore, married Zachariah Minor. The Minor family was unambiguously one of the core Melungeon surnames. That marriage made the Sizemore line ancestral to the Melungeon group, even if the Sizemores themselves were not Melungeon. When a male descendant of George Sizemore's line was tested, the result came back haplogroup Q1, a 3A. That is the Y chromosome designation associated with Native American ancestry in North America. It was confirmed by SNP testing, which pins down specific genetic markers rather than relying on broad haplogroup categories alone. The Sizemore DNA project at Family Tree DNA eventually tested over 100 Sizemore males and found haplogroup Q to be by far the dominant result. The administrators of both the FTDNA Q3 Native American Project and the broader Q Project reviewed the markers and concluded they were most consistent with Native American ancestry, not with the Eurasian populations that also carry haplogroup Q at lower frequencies. Among the documented Melungeon core families and their direct ancestors, the Sizemore line was the only one whose DNA pointed unambiguously to a Native American male in its direct paternal history. Out of every tribal lineage in the database, one stood out, not Cherokee, as the oral tradition most often claimed, simply haplogroup Q1, a 3A, from a family that married into the Melungeon world and left its marker there. The Sizemore result was genetic, without paper documentation. The Riddle family was the mirror image, paper documentation without genetic confirmation. In the written historical records examined by Goins, Estes, and their co-researchers, the Riddle family was the only core Melungeon participant whose documents specifically identified a Native American ancestor. The paper trail was there. The genealogical evidence pointed to indigenous heritage in the Riddle line. Then the DNA came back European. What explains that gap? Genealogists encounter it regularly. Historical documents that claim native ancestry were often created by people motivated to claim it for exactly the same reasons the Melungeons claimed Portuguese ancestry, to shift their legal classification away from African and towards something less constrained by Jim Crow statutes. In Virginia and Tennessee, courts accepted testimony about physical appearance and community standing as evidence of racial classification. A family that could produce witnesses willing to testify they had always known the family as Indian or Portuguese could sometimes secure a legal determination of non-African status. Those determinations then became part of the documentary record. The document said Native American, the DNA said Northern European. The paper trail was the courtroom strategy, not the genetic reality. The 2012 study was careful to hold both results together without discarding either. Written records agree with Melungeon DNA results was the title Jack Goins used for a related article, and the point was precise. Where the DNA pointed to Africa, African surnames and records confirmed it. Where the DNA pointed to Europe, European ancestry lines confirmed it. The Riddle case was not a contradiction of the method. It was a demonstration of exactly how and why Melungeon families built paper identities that diverged from the biology their descendants would one day sequence. The legal architecture that forced the Melungeons to become something they were not took roughly 2 centuries to construct and was still being applied in living memory. Virginia began legislating racial categories in the 1660s, when the colony made the status of a child follow the status of the mother. It followed in 1670 by forbidding free African Americans from owning white servants, a right some had exercised during the earlier indentured period. By the early 1700s, Virginia and North Carolina both legally forbade intermarriage between whites and Africans, Native Americans, or people of mixed descent. Tennessee followed with its own racial restrictions in the 19th century. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 contributed further by pushing the dehumanization of anyone with indigenous ancestry in the region. Melungeon men who served in World War I and were conscripted were in some cases sent to serve as Negroes. Historical records from Hancock County document that this provoked legal action from Melungeon soldiers who refused the designation. The most sweeping instrument came in Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which defined a white person as someone with no trace whatsoever of non-Caucasian blood, with a narrow exception for people who had 1/16 or less of American Indian ancestry, the so-called Pocahontas exception. Under this law, Melungeon marriages were invalidated. Birth certificates were reclassified. Families that had lived as white for generations suddenly had that status challenged. The consequence was not abstract. It determined whether you could own property, whether you could vote, whether your children could attend the same school as white children. The Portuguese claim, the Cherokee grandmother, the Turkish sailor, these were not colorful folk myths. They were the vocabulary of a legal defense that had to be maintained across generations because the alternative was documented subordination. The 2012 Journal of Genetic Genealogy paper settled some questions and made others larger. What the DNA confirmed was this: the core Melungeon families were a multi-ethnic population rooted primarily in free people of color who carried European, African, and in the case of the Sizemore ancestral line, Native American ancestry into the Appalachian Mountains. That is not a simple story. It is not the Portuguese explorer story or the Cherokee grandmother story. It is the story of people who were present at the very first moment of colonial America, who built lives and families before the machinery of race-based slavery had fully closed, and who were then squeezed by that machinery into mountain isolation for 2 centuries. Researchers noted that the Melungeon community is not unique. The Melungeon Heritage Association has identified at least 200 similar mixed ethnic groups in the eastern United States: the Guineas of West Virginia, the Wesorts of Maryland, the Nanticokes and Moors of Delaware, the Lumbee of North Carolina, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina. All of them formed in the same colonial crucible. All of them navigated the same closing of racial categories. All of them built survival identities that diverged from their genetics. For descendants taking DNA tests today, the Melungeon result tends to arrive as a specific combination: European mitochondrial lines, sub-Saharan African Y chromosome lines, and occasionally, through ancestral families like the Sizemores, a trace of Native American marker that fits the haplogroup Q signature found consistently in indigenous people of North America. The oral tradition was not entirely wrong. The Native American ancestor existed. The DNA found her family. It was not the Cherokee or Creek grandmother the stories named. It was a man named George Sizemore, whose Y chromosome carried the mark of a people who had been on this continent since long before any colonial ship arrived. A people can carry 2 centuries of lies in their DNA and still have the truth written there, waiting. The Melungeons of Newman's Ridge claim to be Portuguese because the courts required it. They claim to be Cherokee because the mountains allowed it. They built identities from whatever the law permitted, and they passed those identities down as family history because they had no safer option. When the DNA finally came back in 2012, it confirmed what the oldest documents had suggested all along. These were the free children of colonial Virginia, born before slavery locked the categories in place, squeezed into the mountains by laws they had no power to repeal. The one Native American line that stood out did not belong to the families whose oral histories claimed it most loudly. It belonged to a family that had simply married in, quietly, generations deep, and left a single Y chromosome marker that haplogroup testing could read 400 years later. That is what makes the Melungeon story matter beyond Tennessee. Every piece of recorded history is also a legal document. Every legal document reflects the power that wrote it. Only the DNA is disinterested, and it remembers.
Thanks for watching this video. Before you go, your raw DNA data has hidden stories waiting to be unlocked. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook copy and find out what they are.